Class, today we're going to learn about queues, another data type that we're going to learn about. Now, the rules that define queues are as follows. It's essentially a the same thing, like a place to store data where when you add, it's called on queue. It's like a lineup. Like when you stand in line, the first person who stands in the line should be the first person that gets queued, that gets served. Okay, so there's an on queue method, which means add to the front of my queue, and there's a dequeue method, which is a removal of the first. It's first in, first out. So the first thing in is the first thing out. This will be next, and as I add more, they have to wait for everything else to be removed from the queue before you can access it. Okay, and how do we build something like that? If you want, you can pause the video right now, or we can go ahead and continue with building a queue. So before we continue, I just want to say that in the last video, it wasn't working because I had an integers here. So if you did it yourself and you troubleshooted, you should know that this has to be changed to integer. Okay, so now that I've taken care of that, let's go and build my queue. Queue is spelled Q-U-E-U-E. Queue. Okay, so how are we going to build our queue? Class queue, and we can say private. Private. I'm fully comfortable using an array list, and integer. And let's call it items. Now, outside of my queue, I will have no idea that I have this value right here as an item. I'll just have something called pop and something called dequeue and something called onQueue, which adds to my queue and removes from my queue. So if we want to use isEmpty from the array list library, we cannot, because we shouldn't even know that queue is made up of items. Okay, it's like an abstract data type. All right, so public queue, open and close brackets, and this is going to look exactly like our stack. Equals new array list. And I can throw in, last time I didn't throw in anything, but I can say integer right here. Integer. Open and close brackets. And that's my queue. It's just a series of, in this case, it's an integer of queues. So how do I create my toString? To be honest, it's exactly the same as before. So I'm just going to take it, copy and paste it. Now, later on, we'll go over copying and pasting values. Oops, I forgot to return results as well. So Control C. Anytime you want to copy and paste code, there's an easier way to do it. And we'll talk about that in a later video this week as well. Something to do with inheritance, if you've ever heard of that. We'll talk about that later. Okay, so there's my toString methods. Now, public void onQueue. Queue UI. And we're going to add an int new item. And how do we add to our new item? Well, pretty much works the same as an array list. This dot items dot add new item. All right, how about dequeue? Well, we're going to return the first item that was placed. So how do we do that? Well, public int, because we're going to return it. We're going to return it and we're going to return it, and we're going to remove it. Actually, I should probably put these as all lowercase. DQ int, well, the first item in equals this dot items dot remove the first item, and we can return first in. And that's all there is to it. And one more method belongs to check if the queue is empty. Queue. And that's how you create a queue. You basically make sure that when you add something, it's added and it's the first thing removed. So the first in is the first item, and when you remove it, the second item becomes the first and the first item becomes the last. Anyway, we'll test that right here on my code. Just like before, when we ran our code, it wasn't working for some reason in a previous video. So we'll test out stack and we'll test out queue in this video. So, oh, I forgot to add. I forgot to import. Anytime you use an array list, import java.util dot just everything. Run this code again. I have a feeling I have some errors somewhere, but we'll see that right now. First, spelled it wrong. Let's do this again. There we go. When I add my stack, it just keeps adding, just like an array list. But let's keep adding things. Control C. Let's change some items. If I run, you're going to see that system out.println is the same thing as a print this S, Control C. And as you can see, every time I add, it gets added, just like an array list. And if we do s.pop, and then we print it, s.pop, then we print it, then s.pop, and we print it, you're going to see that every time we pop, it'll return the last item, and it'll remove that item from our list, the last thing added. Oh, for God's sakes, I forgot to as you can see, every time we pop, it's the last item that was added, and it just gets removed. Now, if we change this to a queue, s equals, actually, let's just create a new one. So q equals new q. Q dot on queue. And let's add 1 Q dot on Q 2, and let's see what happens when you print Q. Let's indicate right here that we're going to start working on Q's to separate our outputs. Don't forget your semicolons, like me. And fix your spelling errors. Run. 1, 2 is added, and in fact, let's just add a bunch of more stuff. And if I system.out.println q.dq, and then I print Q, you're going to see that the first item that got added, not the last, gets removed every time. One, two, then 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. As soon as I remove 1, that gets removed from the front of the list. The 2 gets removed from the front of the list. The 1 gets removed from the front of the list, and the 2 gets removed from the front of the list. And basically, that's the data structure of a queue. Okay, coming up next will be linked lists and some exercises, of course.